Well, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming today to this, what we're calling a pop-up event. This idea that exciting things happen in the world that we at our university should be ready to respond to them. And that's exactly what's happened over the last couple of months in response to some changes in climate policy. So I'm Pam McElwee. I'm in the Department of Human Ecology, together with the Rutgers Climate and Energy Institute. We wanted to put together this event to talk a little bit about what is going on at the federal level in terms of climate policy, particularly regarding the Environmental Protection Agency's obligation to potentially regulate greenhouse gas emissions and create climate policy. What the current administration has been doing. A lot of this happened over the summer. Some of you may not have been following it closely. So we wanted to give an update to everyone, talk a little bit about what's happening, what the implications are, how Rutgers people have been involved in responding to some of these changes, and then give some time for question and answers so that people can have a good sense of what's happening. So we have quite a few people online as well. Thank you to those of you that are online for joining us. Marjorie Kaplan from RCE will be monitoring the chat. So if you have questions or any problems, please put anything in the chat. But our schedule today is to start with Professor Cymie Payne, who's in the Department of Human Ecology and is a lawyer by training. She's going to give us an introduction to what the EPA's endangerment finding is, why it is being challenged or changed by the current Trump administration, what the implications of that are for climate policy. Then we're going to hear from Dr. Bob Kopp, who was a distinguished professor over in Earth and Planetary Sciences, who was very strongly involved, one of the two key people in presenting a climate science report that contested some of these changes that were being proposed. And then we're going to hear from Dr. Bill Hallman, who is also a distinguished professor in our Department of Human Ecology, who has been very involved in the National Academy of Sciences. The National Academy of Sciences also did a response, did a fast track assessment. These are quite unusual. And as I said, I'm also in human ecology. I'll be moderating this event. I've been involved in some of these things as well. So we're all here to answer your questions. So we'll do these fairly short presentations, and then all the panelists will be up here to answer questions after they go through some of the content. So any questions before we get started? Great. Well, then I will invite Professor Cymie Payne to come up and share her thoughts with us.
Thank you, Pam. And thank you all who are here in person and who are listening and who will listen to the recording eventually. And I'm just going to hold this up. Are you voting? This is one of the most crucial pieces of information that we need to take away from today. So the Trump administration's all-out efforts to support the fossil fuel industry have led it to propose to rescind what's called the endangerment finding, which I'll explain. But what it does is, by rescinding it, it will remove the legal authority for EPA to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act. Trump's EPA also seeks to prevent states from regulating greenhouse gases, although this particular measure doesn't do that directly. This issue is about the Clean Air Act. Other laws will continue to regulate greenhouse gases, but as Joe Gottman said this afternoon in another webinar on this topic, the Trump administration is trying to create a wall that will make it legally impossible to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act and under other laws, not just for their administration, but for the future. So this is very serious. So what is the endangerment finding? In 2009, it was adopted and it provides the authority to regulate greenhouse gases under the Federal Clean Air Act. Section 202A1 of that act requires the EPA administrator to determine whether the emission of any air pollutant from any class or classes of new motor vehicles or new motor vehicle engines, which in his or her judgment cause or contribute to air pollution which may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health or welfare. Okay, that's the critical language. The Bush administration is saying that the Clean Air Act notably does not authorize regulation to address global climate change, especially from cars and trucks. And in any event, regulation of motor vehicle greenhouse gas emissions would not be appropriate for international policy reasons. Now, this is very similar. There's a lot more that they say. It's like a 78-page Federal Register notice with all the rationales, but they're essentially reciting all of the arguments that were made by the Bush administration in refusing to regulate greenhouse gases or even consider it under the Clean Air Act. And the Bush administration position was essentially refuted by the US Supreme Court in the 2007 case, Massachusetts versus EPA. Okay, so in that case, the court held that the term air pollutant is broad enough to encompass greenhouse gases. On this point, the court actually said in its majority opinion was unambiguous. The Bush administration did the analysis, therefore, to see if the endangerment was an effect of greenhouse gases. They sent it on to, apparently the emails were never opened. This was towards the end of the administration. So the Obama administration comes in and it makes the finding. It does all of the scientific and analysis that supports the finding that 6 well-mixed greenhouse gases endanger both the public health and the public welfare of current and future generations, and that the emissions of these greenhouse gases from new motor vehicles cause or contribute to that dangerous air pollution. So those connected ideas are what leads to EPA regulating mobile source emissions. Okay. What does EPA have to do now to withdraw this finding? They have to go through a rulemaking process, the same process that the Obama administration went through to adopt it. So the comment period, they published in August the proposal. The comment period where the public could respond ended last week. And now they need to go through all the comments and explain why how their proposal responds to those comments. I think I want to comment quickly on a couple of things. One is that there are separate endangerment findings for other areas of the Clean Air Act, other applications, but this is the crucial one that will ultimately influence how those are dealt with. Legally, EPA is arguing that the Clean Air Act doesn't authorize the agency to regulate greenhouse gas emissions because it is intended to regulate local or regional exposures, and this is a global issue. They also say that there's not enough emissions from US mobile sources, even though that's 30% of US emissions, roughly 28% from 2022 reports. And the US is about 30% of global emissions. So, but they're saying that's not enough for this to matter. They also, so to sustain the argument that they're lacking authority, the Supreme Court will have to overrule itself in the Massachusetts versus EPA case, because it's all the same arguments that are in play here. Unfortunately, that was a 5-4 decision, and 3 of the dissenters are still on the court. None of the justices who were in the majority are still on the court. So there's the factual issues also, which my colleagues are going to speak to, but part of the argument is even if the Clean Air Act gives EPA the legal authority, the scientific evidence is too uncertain. The scientific basis for the 2009 finding was flawed. And So also EPA makes the argument that there's no technology available that would remedy the problem. Okay. So quickly, what is the effect of withdrawing it? No regulation of greenhouse gases from mobile sources. If EPA is successful in reversing the federal government recognition of the underlying science, which was the basis for these other regulations of power plants and industrial emissions, then there would be reduced regulation of greenhouse gas emissions from stationary sources. In the future, to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, Congress would have to pass specific climate change laws. Okay, we know how easy that's going to be. For regulated industries, this is kind of an interesting one. It withdraws the basis for a lot of their procedures and processes and investments. So they're not necessarily 100% thinking this is a great idea. And it will create regulatory uncertainty for many years while this is being litigated. What will remain? State laws regulating greenhouse gases from stationary sources, although EPA is trying to block those on the bizarre ground that Congress delegated to EPA the decision whether or and how to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. That's a little weird when they're saying they don't have the authority to do that. RGGI, the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, should be untouched. Actually, what I've read is that it may get the carbon prices might get stronger because of the shifts in what's regulated. We'll see how that works. And there are still federal laws that regulate other air pollutants that are co-pollutants that are emitted with greenhouse gases. So when those things like particulate matter, when those are regulated, then greenhouse gases are regulated with them. I think I can end there just to say that when is this likely to come into effect? Mid-2027 at the earliest is the expert guess from various people who are experts on how long these processes take. So thank you for your attention, Bob Kopp.
Thank you, Cymie. We got here.
Yeah.
So I'm going to sort of talk about the scientific arguments laid in the EPA endangerment finding. But just to recapitulate a little bit what Cymie said, there's essentially two arguments made in the endangerment finding regarding, can you make it full screen?
Yep.
Regarding why EPA doesn't have the authority to regulate. One is a statutory interpretation of the Clean Air Act. The other is arguing against the scientific basis. I'm not going to say much about the statutory basis, except to say that, as Naomi Oreskes has pointed out, the first presidential advisory report on climate change was in 1965. Climate change has a problem associated with pollution was well known to the authors of the Clean Air Act. And the language used in the Clean Air Act is consistent with them actually having that in mind. Yes.
Okay.
Well,
Okay.
There should be a
Yeah, that's what I'm not finding out.
All right, I'm not going to spend a lot of time.
Yeah. There we go.
So talking about the science in the report. So basically, the scientific argument in the endangerment proposed rule relies very heavily on a report that the Department of Energy issued that was published on July 29th, the same day as the report, and which had no public trail prior to the EPA proposed rule. This report was called the Department of Energy Climate Working Group report. EPA actually relies on a draft that was dated May 27th that has not been publicly released. So nobody has actually seen the report upon which EPA is relying, just a slightly updated version that came out at the end of July. So this is the report. It has 5 authors, as you can see on the right, and it has an interesting history. So CNN asked Secretary of Energy Chris Wright how it came together, and Wright says, I just made a list of who do I think are the true honest scientists, about a dozen of them, and they thought were very senior and well respected, and I called the top 5, and everybody said yes. So that is a idiosyncratic way of creating a federal advisory committee. And there are 5 authors. Each of them has published a book that can give you a flavor of their thinking. So what is this report? It is written with a goal of reaching a predetermined conclusion. It doesn't explicitly say that, but that goal is presumably to support the arguments in the EPA proposed rule. And it is full of misunderstandings of the scientific literature, selective citations, cherry picking, omissions of contrary evidence, and other rhetorical techniques. It is as much a work of rhetoric as of scientific review. It is not a national climate assessment or intergovernmental plan on climate change report. The US government is legally required every 4 years to produce a national climate assessment. The last one was produced in 2023 and provides a relatively up-to-date assessment of climate change impacts on the US. It is not an unbiased representation of the state of climate science, as you could probably gather by looking at the titles of the books produced by the authors. It is not, as a court has indicated, in compliance with the Federal Advisory Committee Act. It is not peer-reviewed by independent experts following a rigorous process as required by the Information Quality Act for highly influential scientific assessments. And as far as we can tell, it is not peer-reviewed in any form, although maybe it underwent some internal peer review at DOE. So to talk a little bit like a lawyer and maybe give you a sampling of the science, but the science takes a while to address. So let's just talk about the Federal Advisory Committee Act. This was the subject of a lawsuit brought by the Environmental Defense Fund and the Union of Concerned Scientists in August. Federal advisory committees must publish a Federal Register notice describing the nature and purpose of the committee, file a charter with Congress, have a designated agency officer attending each meeting, be fairly balanced in terms of point of view, assure advice not inappropriately influenced by appointing authorities, so that would be the secretary, must conduct a broad outreach for recruiting nominees, must hold open publicly announced meetings, and must comply with open records requirements. DOE tried to get around these requirements by appointing all of the 5 authors as special government employees. Apparently, one of them failed to file the appropriate paperwork. And so as of September 3rd, the working group was dissolved. So it is unclear how the public comments on the working group report will ever be addressed. And I haven't actually been following this case recently and much in the last 2 weeks, so I don't know what further has happened with this. But DOE was arguing that it was moot with this withdrawal. The plaintiffs were arguing, well, EPA is still relying on this science, so it's not moot. The other thing which has not been litigated yet is the Information Quality Act. The Information Quality Act sets up a set of guidelines, or instructs OMB to set up a set of guidelines for highly influential scientific assessments, which are defined as scientific assessments that could have a potential impact of more than $500 million a year, or that are novel, controversial, precedent-setting, or have significant interagency interest. These apply to this climate working group report, as indicated by the fact that EPA is the primary user. These highly influential scientific assessments have to undergo a peer review process that has a set of requirements relating to expertise, experience, and independence from the sponsoring agency, or that can be shortcut by asking the national academies to peer review the report. And the agency has to respond to all of the comments in the peer review process. That has not happened. What has happened is that at the end of July, Andy Dessler at Texas A&M posted on Blue Sky, does anyone know of a coordinated response that would take any single person months of work to go through and point out all of the errors. And then 1 month later, in the last half of August, helped Andy out a lot with this, but we ended up with the climate experts review of the DOE Climate Working Group report, which is an independent, self-organized review that involved 85 named climate experts and a few others who chose not to be named. And it's all archived on the web. So as I said, self-organized review, 48 distinct comments, nearly 450 pages, so about 3 times the length of the original report and about 15 times as many authors. So I was very impressed by how the scientific community was able to come together on its own without structure and try to provide, I think we tried to provide a fair expert review that this report honestly did not deserve, but that because it is a report of the US government nonetheless demands. So I, rather than going through a whole lot of examples, will just give you a few examples of the style of what the DOE report argues. So the DOE report argues that most extreme weather events in the US do not show long-term trends. For instance, for the continental United States as a whole, the evidence suggests that greenhouse gas emissions have had little to no effect on heat waves. And the basis for this argument is charts like this. This is looking at the number of days above 105 degrees Fahrenheit per station in the lower 48 United States. And you notice if you look past the 1940s, you see this growing trend over time, but there is a lot of hot records set in the 1930s. Those of you who have read Grapes of Wrath will know what's going on there. That is the Dust Bowl. What is going on here is greenhouse gas forcing. And what this is doing is confusing natural variability of the climate with greenhouse gas forcing. And it is also focusing in on a very narrow region of the globe, which is not what you would want to do. So if you wanted to make an assessment of global climate. If you look across the Northern Hemisphere, you see this record, which is very consistent with what you would expect from the climate forcing. So this sort of cherry picking and omission of relevant data is characteristic of a lot of the arguments in this report. There's also oversimplification. So in the same report claims that that hurricanes are not becoming more frequent or intense. And they focus exclusively on the fact that hurricanes making landfall in the United States aren't increasing, but nor are they expected to increase. Nobody was arguing from the science that they are. But hurricanes are becoming more intense in terms of the wind speed. They're intensifying more quickly. They're producing more rain, and they are producing more coastal flooding. So it is simply wrong to say that the impact of hurricanes on the United States is not increasing. I'm going to skip over sea level and point out this is a part that Pam was involved in authoring, pointing out that the report says nothing, although it's being used by the Environmental Protection Agency, which I think has something to do with protecting nature. It's being used by the Environmental Protection Agency, but this report says nothing about natural system or nature's contributions to people. It doesn't talk about how climate change is impacting wildlife or biodiversity, which has effects on human welfare through things like reduced pollination and fisheries yields, damage to agriculture, damage to ecotourism, the effects of invasive species, and cultural losses. The report argues that CO2-induced warming might be less damaging economically than commonly believed. This is another good example of cherry picking. This chart over on the right is histograms from the scientific literature of estimates of the social cost of carbon, which is an economic estimate of the damage done by a ton of CO2. So this is all these blue ones. They go from negative $50 per ton of carbon to $800 per ton of carbon. And these examples over here on orange are the ones that are discussed by the DOE report. So the report is focusing not just on what experts think are most likely, but on a small subset of papers supporting estimates lower than the most likely estimate. And yet we know if we're trying to manage risk, we need to think about the bad case scenarios, not just Van Glossian scenarios. The report's approach would argue against things like purchasing insurance, maintaining a standing army in peacetime, and many other regularly accepted precautionary measures. And the report also argues, and this gets back to what Cymie was saying as a crux of the matter in the EPA report, proposed rule, that excessively aggressive mitigation policies could prove more detrimental than beneficial. And this is an example of a straw man argument. Well, indeed, the mitigation policies are excessively aggressive, then definitionally, they are presumably more harmful than beneficial. But what is excessively aggressive? Well, if you take what we were just looking at and look at this cherry pick example of selection of studies arguing that the social cost of carbon is very low or negative, then it doesn't take much for regulation to be excessively aggressive. But if you look at the full distribution, it's much harder. And moreover, actually, a lot of the policies being rolled by this administration have substantial benefits apart from their climate benefits. Just throwing up a chart from Rhodium Group suggesting that the reconciliation bill, big beautiful bill that the Congress passed earlier this year will have the effect in 2035 of increasing household energy expenditures by about $100 to $200 a year. So to conclude, let's remember what we do know. And I think this will feed into what the National Academy study Bill talks about, will focus on. It's an unequivocal fact that human actions are heating Earth's atmosphere, surface, and oceans. As a consequence of this, global average sea level is rising. Heat waves, heavy rainfalls, agricultural droughts, hurricanes, and fire weather are becoming more frequent, severe, and/or destructive as a result. And we also know that the more we heat the planet, we run a greater risk of unmanageable surprises. Stabilizing the climate requires bringing net greenhouse gas emissions to zero. And adaptation to changes not avoided is essential to limit damages, but has limits and is not free. And some forms of adaptation require public planning and investment, which is another thing this administration is not particularly enthusiastic about. Thanks.
Great. Our last speaker will be Bill Hallman. And for those of you that are online, there's a Q&A function. So the chat is not functional, but the Q&A function is where you can ask questions that we will get to in just a minute. So let's share this. Oops. There you go.
Great. Thanks very much.
So thank you very much for the invitation to join this august group of speakers. I'm Bill Hallman from the Department of Human Ecology. And Pam, I thought you were also speaking, so I was misled into, yeah, you're moderating. Okay. So thanks to everybody who's here in person. Thanks to everybody online. I've been tasked with talking about the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine report that was just released called Effects of Human-Caused Greenhouse Gas Emissions on U.S. Climate, Health, and Welfare. And for students, particularly, who may not be familiar with the National Academy of Sciences, it was established during the Civil War in 1863 through an act of Congress that was signed by Abraham Lincoln. And its purpose explicitly was to provide independent, objective advice to the U.S. government on matters of science and technology whenever called upon. And that remains its main objective. So it began with the National Academy of Sciences. It was joined by the National Academy of Engineering in 1964 and by the National Academy of Medicine, which was initially called the Institute of Medicine in 1970. That name changed in 2015. And so we refer to the National Academies to refer to the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, which has really become a cornerstone of U.S. science policy, bridging government needs with independent scientific expertise. And I think several of my colleagues in the room have been on National Academy committees. I have, and others. So just a word about a group within the National Academies that you may or may not have heard of. It's called the Climate Crossroads at the National Academies. It was established in 2023 with a mission of harnessing the breadth of the National Academy's expertise, resources, and advice to catalyze actions to meet the climate crisis. So the idea is to use all of the resources of the National Academies across sciences, engineering, and medicine to focus on climate. The Climate Crossroads Advisory Committee is charged with providing high-level guidance on emerging needs and opportunities for cross-academies climate-related activities. And I have the honor of serving on that particular committee, and our committee was extremely supportive of the National Academies engaging in this particular report. So I have to tell you that I am not an author of the report, and I am not necessarily representing the National Academies. I'm here to bring this report to your attention and to give you a sense of what's in it. So again, the reason for the study, obviously, the EPA called for public comments as it considered the status of the endangerment finding that Cymie and Bob have talked about. This is the report. It's just come out within the last couple of weeks. And I have made it so easy for you to download this report using your phone. All you need to do is to scan the QR code and boof, it will be right there for you. So I'll give you 3, 2, 1 to do that, and I'll put it up at the very end on my last slide as well. I'm just warning you that it's coming up. All right. So download the report, and it's extremely interesting. It's extremely useful. It was put together by the Committee on Anthropogenic Greenhouse Gases and U.S. Climate Evidence and Impacts, 15 scientists there. And for those of you, again, who are not particularly familiar with the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, to be elected as a member of the academies is a big deal. I am not a big deal, and so I'm not a member of the National Academies, but most of these folks are, and you will note in parentheses which of the academies they are a member of, and several of them are members of more than one academy. So in order to be elected to the National Academies, you have to be recognized by your peers as an outstanding scientist, as an outstanding research scientist. So most of these folks are members of the National Academies, not just simply making a list of 12 people and picking the top 5 who would say yes. It was the chair of the committee was Shirley Tillman, who had been the president of Princeton University. And I know many of these folks. We've already talked about the endangerment finding. Essentially, in 2009, EPA concluded, quote, that 6 greenhouse gases taken in combination endanger both the public health and the public welfare of current and future generations. So the word endanger very specifically there. And as Cymie and Bob have noted, this finding allows EPA to regulate greenhouse gas emissions under the Clean Air Act. Then in August of 2025, EPA published a Federal Register notice stating that in making the 2009 endangerment finding, the agency unreasonably analyzed the scientific record. This is their quote. And that subsequent developments cast significant doubt on the reliability of the findings. This is in the Federal Register notice. And I want to highlight these because the report from the National Academies addresses these kind of straight on. And so the Federal Register notice proposed repealing the endangerment finding, and in the process, because there is a rulemaking requirement for public comment, they invited public comments, I would say perhaps reluctantly. So the task of the committee, this is straight from the report. I'm not making anything up. This is directly from them. They were asked whether new evidence since 2009 strengthened or weakened the primary conclusions of the EPA report in 2009, addressed remaining uncertainties in our understanding of climate change, identified new issues related to greenhouse gas emissions and climate change that were not evident or addressed in the 2009 finding, and very specifically concentrated on the effects of human health and welfare in the United States to address the statutory concern of the EPA. We all know that greenhouse gas emissions is a global phenomenon, but EPA doesn't regulate the world, it regulates the US. And so the endangerment pieces here are really focused on potential effects on human health and the environment in the US. And again, directly from the report, the committee's charge was to produce a succinct and balanced evaluation of the state of the science, not to make recommendations or advocate for a specific policy. So straight up, we're going to look at the science and let you know what we have found. So the major conclusions of the report. EPA's 2009 finding that the human-caused emissions of greenhouse gases threaten human health and the welfare was accurate, has stood the test of time, and is now reinforced by even stronger evidence. In bold, directly from the report. Again, today, many of EPA's conclusions are further supported by longer observational records and multiple new lines of evidence. Moreover, research has uncovered additional risks that were not apparent in 2009. But wait, there's more. The evidence for current and future harm to human health and welfare created by human-caused greenhouse gases is beyond scientific dispute, directly from the report. Much of the understanding of climate change that was uncertain or tentative in 2009 is now resolved, and new threats have been identified. These new threats and the areas of remaining uncertainty are under intensive investigation by the scientific community. The United States faces a future in which climate-induced harm continues to worsen and today's extremes become tomorrow's norms. Pretty powerful. So those are the major conclusions. There are 5 conclusions that support this. I'm not going to go through all of this, but merely the bold. Number 1, emissions of greenhouse gases from human activities are increasing the concentration of these gases in the atmosphere. And it talks a bit about those activities, but I want to highlight in blue at the bottom, multiple lines of evidence show that greenhouse gas emissions from human activities are the primary driver of the observed long-term warming trend. No known natural drivers, such as incoming solar radiation or volcanic emissions, can explain observed changes. So that is preempting nonsense, shall we say. Secondly, improved observations confirm unequivocally that greenhouse gas emissions are warming Earth's surface and changing the Earth's climate. And in longer records, improved, more robust observational networks, so on, go to show this. So we've got better observations that confirm what we knew in 2009 and reify that. Number 3, greenhouse gas emissions and climate change endanger human health. This goes directly to the endangerment finding. Human-caused emissions of greenhouse gases and resulting climate change harm the health of people in the United States. That is directly from the report. It intensifies risk to humans from exposures to extreme heat, ground-level ozone, airborne particulate matter, extreme weather events, and airborne allergens, affecting the incidence of cardiovascular, respiratory, and other diseases. Climate change has increased exposure to pollutants from wildfire smoke and dust, which have been linked to adverse health effects. The increasing severity of some extreme events has contributed to injury, illness, and death in affected communities. Health impacts related to climate-sensitive infectious diseases, such as those carried by insects and contaminated water, have increased. New evidence is developing about additional health impacts of climate change, including to mental health, nutrition, immune health, microbial resistance, kidney disease, and adverse pregnancy-related outcomes. And it goes on to talk about particularly vulnerable populations. Greenhouse gas emissions and climate change endanger the welfare of the people and the environment in the United States. Changes in climate resulting from human-caused emissions of greenhouse gases harm the welfare of people in the US. It goes on to document climate-driven changes in temperature and precipitation extremes are negatively impacting agriculture and livestock, even as technology and other changes have increased agricultural production. Climate change, including increased climate vulnerability and wildfires, is changing the composition and function of forest and grassland ecosystems. It's creating changes in water availability and quality. It is creating changes in chemistry and oceans heat content, negatively affecting calcifying organisms, negatively affecting calcifying organisms and contributing to increases in harmful algal blooms, and so on. And then it finally concludes with continued emissions, we have more climate change. Continued emissions of greenhouse gases from human activities will lead to more climate change in the United States, with the severity of expected change increasing with every ton of greenhouse gases emitted. Again, applying the fundamental physics of the Earth system leads to the same conclusion. Continued changes in climate change increases the likelihood of passing thresholds in Earth systems that could trigger high impact climate events, and so on. Each of the chapters that's devoted to these conclusions has the scientific evidence. It's well documented. What's astonishing is that they were able to do this so rapidly. They did this within a matter of weeks, not a matter of years. I would also note that this report was funded internally through endowment funds to the national academies. Ordinarily, what EPA would do is to ask the national academies to do some sort of a study. That was not the case in this instance, even though, as Bob pointed out, that's sort of the normal route that they would go through. So again, please download the report, read it for yourself. I've made it easy for you. And with that, I think we can take questions.
Great. Thank you to everyone. I have the panelists set up here. And maybe we'll start and see if there's any questions in the room, and then we'll move to online. Yep, Peter.
So Phil, you mentioned that they said with every ton of greenhouse gas emission, bad things happen. And I'm just curious, how frequently is there a ton of greenhouse gas emissions? That doesn't sound like very, that is, it doesn't sound like much. It sounds like a daily amount, it's not a hourly amount.
So I can turn my breath here.
Yeah, I have to figure out how to turn on the microphone. All right, so I think I'm not muted and I think I'm on. Yeah, I mean, the average American emits about 15 tons a year. The world as a whole emits about 40 billion tons a year. So you can do the math. The average American is causing, using the previous US government estimates of the social cost of carbon dioxide, about $3,000 of damage to human welfare every year, greenhouse gas emissions.
Other questions in the room?
And if you could identify yourself too, please.
My name is Dave Howland. Oh, I got a microphone. Goodness, thank you. Hi. My name is Dave Howland. I'm in the writing program at Rutgers, but years ago I did for my dissertation a case study comparison of ozone hole and climate change policy. And so I had a question for you, Bill. You mentioned that National Academy of Sciences report, and I'll just say as an aside, before I forget, thank you, all of you, for all your work here. This is remarkable how much you've been able to accomplish in such a short time in this really difficult and rapid moving policy environment. My question is more looking at the history here. I noticed in your report on the National Academy of Sciences that there was a comment to the effect, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that we're just explaining the science. We're not making policy recommendations. We're just giving you the facts. And way back when we had this huge problem of the stratospheric ozone hole, Sherwood Rowland in particular, he broke with this sort of the scientist's ethical standard of we just report and we'll let the chips fall where they may. And he was excoriated for asking for immediate policy changes to get rid of stratospheric ozone destroying chemicals. Anyway, I was a little surprised to see that in your report, and would think that we're well beyond that. And we all should be screaming to the rafters for immediate policy change. And so to wrap up, my question is, why? Am I misinterpreting something, or are we still playing it so darn straight when the earth is burning?
How much time do you have? So I think that the most straightforward answer is that I'm not typically, yeah, I can typically be heard. I have 3 children and an acre of land, so yeah. The most straightforward answer is that it was specifically put together to be entered as a public comment to the EPA and as an authoritative source to review the science. Even before the report was released, there were conservative members of Congress essentially saying this is a whitewash. We already know what they're going to say because they're politically motivated. And I think it made a lot more sense for the national academies to do what they did, which was to say, we're just reviewing the evidence. We're going to give you, the citations, the peer-reviewed literature. You don't have to believe us. You can go and look it up yourself, more or less, and allow others to use that information to make the policy arguments.
We'll take some online questions after this.
My name is Thomas. I'm a Bloustein student in the MCRP program. I had a kind of a vague question. It seems, especially when you know about like institutional inertia, like when you make these kinds of like really big changes to like how the government functions in respect to research, it's really hard to kind of, put the toothpaste back in the tube. So, I just kind of came to this talk on a whim, and it is kind of like reinforcing stuff I kind of already knew and like vaguely, but it is a bit depressing. So I was wondering, as members of who are very much involved with this, how much like hope do you have for the future in this kind of like specific area of kind of expertise? Because I think it's very easy to talk about how bad the situation is. And if you don't have hope, that's fine. I'd like to hear that too, because me personally, like if you put a gun to my head and ask me to predict the future, I would say like, well, once like one side is committed to playing the game, the other one won't play the game. And once science is kind of weaponized like this and the other side refuses to weaponize science, like the people that want to weaponize it are going to do that. But to just ask you, like, what do you kind of think of that? Do you have more hope for, the next decade, the next 2 decades? Do you think that this kind of institutional inertia is really hard to overcome, or maybe it'll be easier, but, something like that?
Is that on now? Okay, cool. I'm going to answer. So I think you were really asking about it as a science question. I'm going to answer it obviously as a law question because I'm a lawyer and there's better scientists here than I am. There's 2 things that are at play with the endangerment finding in both the long established Administrative Procedure Act, which is the federal law that establishes a very fixed process for certain federal government activities to take place. We call them rulemakings usually. And something like rescinding the endangerment finding requires that process. So it puts in place a kind of stabilizing quality. Things that they have to go through include doing a review that really compels them to compare the previous findings, scientific findings, and any associated social findings with the new proposals. These things all depend on that being honestly done. And if it's not honestly done by the agency, which sometimes it hasn't been, then the agency gets, sued. And then you depend on the judges fairly evaluating that. So that creates this rulemaking process under the Administrative Procedure Act, fondly known as the APA to some of us, stabilizes some things. And in the first Trump administration, that was a tool that was used quite successfully. Not clear whether it's going to function this time. There's another factor which is a little, it kind of cuts in the other direction, although it sounds like it doesn't. There's a relatively recent Supreme Court decision that essentially says that a law like the Clean Air Act, unless it explicitly says it's regulating greenhouse gases, can't be assumed to expand that far. Now, Dr. Kopp has already pointed out that, in fact, the people who drafted the bill were well aware that climate change was a problem. President Johnson got a report on his desk before the Clean Air Act saying that climate change was a problem. So, but that undercuts the ability, it's called the major questions doctrine, and it essentially says executive agencies can't just kind of expand their authority if it's going to have a major impact on the economy or society. Okay, so there's a couple of stabilizing things like that. I personally don't believe that, as a lawyer, I work with scientists a lot. I don't believe science flips. What people are willing to look at with science might change over time. I grew up when nuclear war was a real possibility and when we were in the Vietnam War. And so my hope is that this is a cycle, that it's scary when you're in one of these cycles, but that it is the goodwill and commitment to best scientific evidence and the rule of law that carries us through. And I hope we all share that.
Let's say first, it's not only the Clean Air Act of 1970, the Inflation Reduction Act affirmed that the Clean Air Act applies to greenhouse gases, just not in this particular provision. But more broadly, it is much easier to destroy things than it is to create them. The Soviet Union's scientific research infrastructure has not recovered from the collapse of the Soviet Union. German research infrastructure took a long time to recover from the Nazi era. We will probably know, and if this is broader than climate, there is a very active campaign right now to destroy higher education and the scientific research infrastructure of this country. And if it's successful, I do not think we are going to be recovering our position of global leadership in science. So this is a much broader issue. Our democratic institutions, rule of law, go along with that. I was personally surprised that DOE didn't take the FACA case to the Supreme Court and just try to get the FACA ruled as unconstitutional. I have no confidence that good lower court decisions will be upheld. So I think we're in a very dark time, but we are quite at the end. We've not quite time to give up hope.
Do you want to plug our graduate class?
Yeah, sure. Rachel and I will be teaching a graduate seminar in the spring on climate, democracy, and resilience.
Bill might.
No, let's have another question.
Okay, we have an online question from Professor Tony Broccoli. And Tony is asking, if the endangerment finding is reversed, what would the current administration be able to do that it wouldn't be able to do otherwise by simply choosing to not enforce the existing law?
They don't have to do much. If the foundation for the law is removed, it is the endangerment finding that gives the authority to EPA to regulate mobile sources for their greenhouse gas emissions. So if the endangerment finding doesn't apply to greenhouse gases, then it's not even clear that they need to go through rulemakings to withdraw the laws, because they may just say they're moot.
I think Tony's question was, well, what if you just fire the people responsible for enforcing the law and don't do any of this?
Yeah, but then I think that doesn't have the far-reaching effect they'd like to have. So yeah, it's true that selective enforcement is an issue. I think it's a little harder with something like mobile sources, though, where you're dealing with the automobile industry. It's not like a particular individual polluter. If Tony wants to follow up on that, if we're not hitting the point of his question, I guess we could.
Well, I think you sort of answered We haven't heard from Tony again, but maybe we will. So I think just in general, I think you've mostly answered this, but do you want to sort of go through what happens next?
Well, I don't know what happens next. In theory, they're supposed to do something with all these public comments, but the news article I said suggested they were finalizing this week. So I don't know.
And read really fast. AI probably
yeah.
just.
So Cymie, if you have any insights into what happens next,
I think what happens next is especially in a state like New Jersey, where's my voting card? First of all, make sure that in November, we get people elected in states like New Jersey, well, in every state, that will advance greenhouse gas emission controls in so many ways. Thank you. Yes. Are you voting? That's all you need to know. It's a great website. They'll help you vote. No, a lot of the action can go back to the state level. Obviously, there'll be a lot of litigation. You know, every one of the actions that the Trump administration is taking is going to be litigated. I guess you could send money to the organizations that do the litigation. And remember that things like, you know, the advances in technology are kind of on the ground. Those are boots on the ground. That's going to make, if there's big advances in technologies to reduce in ways that reduce greenhouse gas emissions, that's going to be more effective than any law. So keep your eye on that too.
And first, like on that front, right, and China is rapidly switching to an electrified transport sector. This administration is sort of fighting a rearguard action to sustain old, dirty technology against market forces.
I'll add to that.
I mean, part of the argument to rescind the endangerment finding was that the U.S. emissions are only a small fraction of the global emissions. So in some ways, that kind of cuts both ways, which is even if the U.S. decides to retreat from climate policy, it doesn't mean that other countries are retreating. And in fact, we have a climate meeting coming up in Brazil in a month or so, where the countries are going to continue to hopefully make national progress on a lot of their climate policies. I will also say that, you know, just because the policies go away or they're enforced inadequately and so forth, it doesn't make the health and welfare problems of greenhouse gas emissions go away. And so in addition to all the reports we've been talking about, there was also an additional report put together by the public health experts called the Expert Working Group on Climate Change and Health in the United States. And they went through all of the climate impacts from extreme heat waves to increased asthma, to spread of infectious diseases, to micronutrient changes in the food that we eat. And a lot of those findings related to health are going to continue, you know, to be visible, and almost entirely neglected in the DOE report, which was kind of about climate science, but not about the sort of effects, which was.
Well, it did have chapters on the effect. They were just very.
It had one chapter on mortality from heat. That was it. Yeah, that was it. Right, and it didn't say anything about infectious diseases and their vectors or anything like that. So the point is that, you know, in a normal administration, you would get all of these comments, and the public comments ran about 50 to 1. If anybody was on some of these public comments webinars, urging them not to change, right? And in a normal world, when you get comments that are 50 to 1, basically saying, don't change this policy, right? There are clear scientific and health reasons why we have the endangerment finding. In a normal administration, you would say, oh, well, this would have been a bad, you know, policy change. We're not going to make it. That obviously is not the case for this administration, but it does set the groundwork for a future administration, right? This administration is not going to exist indefinitely. And so future administrations can take all of this bad faith effort and use it to reverse it in the future, right? So we may be looking at 3 years, but, you know, if we continue to push back, then maybe it's only 3 years and not longer.
And in the meantime, it's not just voting, it's individual consumer choice. So there are market forces that can come into play here in the short term. Okay, so we're not going to regulate tailpipe emissions anymore. Okay, but that doesn't matter if you aren't willing to purchase a vehicle that's polluting. And there are other forces in the insurance industry, for example, that would logically push back because it increases their costs because risks go up. So it's not all gloom and doom. So, yeah. Yeah, sorry, yeah.
All right, one special question.
Yeah, no, I just want to emphasize the point that the Professor McElwee made, and that is time may be an ally eventually. And, Bob mentioned the FACA case, the IQA possibility. Cymie mentioned the APA. Lots of comments means the agency has to take more time to respond, or else even a Supreme Court that's hostile to the endangerment finding is going to have a tough time supporting them. And if you, I know people are shrugging, but all you need, we talked about mid-2027 is when something like this would probably take effect. I think that's right. All you need them to do is have to remand to a lower court on one or two of these issues, and you're into 2028 or 2029. And if the case isn't resolved by the next administration, then that administration will do what this one did and just say, well, we're not doing this. The case is moot. I'm generally pessimistic too, but there's not no.
All right, Pam, I think you need to close up here.
Yeah, well, just to say thanks to everybody for coming and the great questions, and maybe to leave it on a slightly more optimistic note. If none of us did anything, then things would continue to be bad. And I think the lesson from this is that people at Rutgers and people in the US are fighting back against these irrational and unscientific approaches and policies, and their strength in numbers, right? I mean, I think this example that Bob gave of the scientists basically coming together on blue sky and just saying, shouldn't somebody respond to it? And then everybody going, yeah, we should respond to it, right? Like it's us coming together in different ways to stopgap a lot of this. And that's what universities are here for, I think, is to get our students involved in these things and train them to do this. And I hope we can continue to do so. So thank you for coming.